All right, intro to genetics. So genetics is interesting because genetics is an increasingly prevalent study in our society. You'll notice more and more headlines today, whether we're looking at tabloids or science magazines, they're going to start to talk to you about genetics. They'll talk about finding genes for intelligence, your smart genes, finding genes for obesity. And then genetics has also bled into our psychology and sociology, where we start hearing headlines or hearing news articles about genes for violence or genes for addiction. What we need to ask ourselves is, how can we make sense of these headlines? So what are they actually saying about the genetics? How is the interaction between genetics and environment determining who we are as people? So what we're going to go over today, a brief history of genetics. We're going to talk a little bit about Mendelian genetics. We'll do more of it in the next video. And then finally, essential genetics vocabulary. So when we talk about it in class, we can have a common language to communicate about this. Oops, skipped one. All right. So we cannot talk about genetics today without talking about the father of modern genetics, Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk who lived between 1822 and 1884. In the early 1830s to mid-1840s, he conducted a series of extensive, very extensive experiments with pea plants. So he was an avid gardener, and he grew pea plants and would cross-pollinate, or he would essentially choose which plants get to reproduce with one another. Then, knowing what traits the parents had, he would take a look at the offspring and study what traits from the parents moved on to the next generation. Now, he did this over the course of more than a decade, and he did this using over 28,000 pea plants. So what I want you to kind of take a minute to consider is that this is a man in a monastery with no electricity who, over the course of more than 10 years, counted and recorded data on over more than 28,000 pea plants. So if you ever feel like you're having a tough day at school, just consider this poor guy sitting in his dark room for hours and hours on end, counting peas and then recording them in a notebook. So we have to give him credit for his hard work. And then we also have to recognize that there was a little bit of dumb luck involved in his discovery. So he found that while he was counting all of these and recording the data on what he was getting for offspring, so if he knew that he had a green parent and he had a yellow parent, he would look at what he got for offspring. If he knew he had two green parents, what he got for offspring. So he found that there was a predictable ratio among those, but the predictable ratio was really the result of dumb luck on his part. He just happened to get lucky in the sense that he chose traits that were actually simple Mendelian traits. So they only had one gene that controlled their inheritance. So good luck on his part. So vocabulary for us, the first one, genetics, the study of heredity. So we're going to be looking at how traits pass between generations. Here's another example of a karyotype. This time I gave you an example of a male one because I didn't think I'd given you one before. So here's your X chromosome from the male and then small Y chromosome, not Y-shaped. A trait is any characteristic that can be passed from parent to offspring. This is what we call heritable. The term heritable gets terribly misused in society today. You'll hear people say, I inherited my love of golf from my grandfather. Golf loving is not a gene. It's not something you can inherit. But here are a couple of examples of some things you can. So the first one, widow's peak. So if you pull your hairline back and you have a little indent or rather outcrop right here, that's your widow's peak. Hitchhiker's thumb is another one. And then there's your classic ones that you guys see in your families. Hair color, eye color, skin color. So we see right here, these ladies clearly got some more of mom's DNA than dad's. Some traits are not genetic and therefore cannot be passed between generations via DNA. So if you learn how to play the guitar, your children will not know how to play the guitar because you learned it. Same thing, je ne parle français. If you learn French, Spanish, Latin, you are not going to have children that will know French, Spanish, or Latin. A gene is a piece of DNA that codes for a trait. Now, Mendel didn't know the term, so he just called these particles. So he had the particle for green coloring and the particle for yellow coloring. And then he would look at how these particles moved on to the offspring. Now we now know that genes are sections of chromosomes. So here's your chromosome. A little section of this chromosome is a gene. And we know that you get one gene from mom, one gene from dad. You combine those two and you get traits such as tongue rolling or non-tongue rolling. Your alleles, these are the different forms or versions of a gene. So when you get one from mom and one from dad, you might get different versions of this information from dad and mom. Alleles are usually dominant or recessive. So we'll talk about dominant alleles. versus recessive alleles. So those are dominant versions of a trait versus recessive versions of a trait. Dominant alleles are going to be expressed. This is what you're going to see if they're present. So if there's one dominant allele in simple Mendelian genetics, we're going to talk about exceptions to this, you will see it. They're represented by a capital letter. So when we try to do genotypes, which we'll talk about in a second, you always represent dominant as a capital versus recessive allele. Recessive alleles are not expressed when one dominant is present. You only see recessives when you have two recessives, and these are represented by a lowercase r. So in the example here, tongue rolling is dominant to non-tongue rolling, which means Daniel Radcliffe here that is rolling his tongue, we know that he has to either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. We know he's got to at least have one dominant trait. Whereas Emma Watson, we know her genotype right off the bat because she can't do it, which means she has to be recessive. So terms I just mentioned, but you need to know. Homozygous, homo means same. So if you are homozygous dominant, you have two versions of the dominant. If you are homozygous recessive, you have two versions of the recessive trait. These are also called purebreds. So if I say purebred tongue roller, it means it is a homozygous dominant person. If I said a purebred non-tongue roller, homozygous recessive. Heterozygous is easy because hetero means different. It means you have a different version of each allele. It means you're always going to have one dominant, one recessive. Genotypes, these are the set of genes that a person gets. So if I ask you for genotype, I want the letters. I want to know if it's heterozygous, homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive. Phenotype is what you actually see in the individual. So when you look at the person, what trait do you see? So the example here, this could be homologous chromosomes, so chromosomes with the same info on them. You get maybe blue info from mom for eye color, brown info from dad. Brown is dominant, blue is recessive, meaning that you are going to have a heterozygous individual. But because they have that one dominant brown allele, your phenotype is brown eyes. So this is what this person would look like. Little comprehension check for you guys. So the first one, who is referred to as the father of modern genetics? Good, Gregor Mendel. Number two, what model organism did he use to conduct his experiments? Hopefully you got that one. Pea plants. He used pea plants. All right, little tricky one. An individual is heterozygous for tongue rolling. So you got to remember what we said about tongue rolling. What is their genotype? So we have to remember heterozygous is the easy one. Hetero means different, meaning you're going to have one dominant, one recessive. So one capital letter, one lowercase letter. What is their phenotype? Good. So as long as they have one dominant allele in simple Mendelian genetics, they will have the trait. So a heterozygous individual has one gene for tongue rolling, meaning they will be a tongue roller. See me if you have any questions. Nice work, guys.